In this final lecture, I want to talk again about the distinctions between forgiveness and reconciliation, talk about why reconciliation is pragmatically important, and then talk about how to reconcile. Now, we've mentioned this before, but I think it's important for us to go over this again. The fact that forgiveness is one person's moral response to another person's injustice. Reconciliation is two peoples coming together to restore a relationship whose trust was broken. Now, it takes one person to reconcile. It takes one person to forgive. It takes two people to reconcile. Forgiving happens inside a wounded person. Reconciliation happens in the relationship between two people. We can forgive somebody who's never sorry. We cannot be truly reconciled with someone unless he is honestly sorry. We can forgive even if we don't trust the person who wronged us. But reconciliation can happen only if we trust the person who wronged us that he will not wrong us again. Forgiving comes with no strings attached. Reconciliation has a number of strings attached, as we will see. So, once again, let's look at the who, what, how, where, and how-tos of forgiveness and reconciliation. Who? Forgiveness takes one person. Reconciliation takes two or more. What? Forgiveness is a gift granted to the wrongdoer. But in reconciliation is earned, not granted. How? Forgiveness at its deepest level is emotional replacement. We said there is decisional forgiveness and emotional forgiveness, wherein our emotions, our hot and cool emotions of hatred, anger, bitterness, are replaced with emotions of love and compassion. But the how for reconciliation is behavioral replacement. Where? Forgiveness happens inside of us. But for reconciliation happens within the relationship. And how to do it? Well, we saw the pyramid reach model. Recall the hurt, have empathy towards the offender, give the altruistic gift of forgiveness, commit publicly to forgive, and hold on to forgiveness. The reach model. But as we will see, for reconciliation, there is another model called the bridge model, which we will be talking about in some depth in this lecture. Now, why is reconciliation practically or pragmatically important? In the last lecture, we saw scripturally that it goes to the very heart of the gospel, and we have all been given the ministry of reconciliation, both as individuals and as churches. But pragmatically, as we saw with forgiveness, that practically, forgiveness is important for us beyond the scriptural mandate to forgive. Reconciliation is likewise. Reconciliation is a witness of God's power and demonstrates our obedience to the most important commandment Christ gave us on the night before he died. On the night before he died, he said, "A new commandment I give you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." So without reconciliation, we fail to show the world the single most important evidence that we are Christ's disciples. Because you cannot love someone truly and not endeavor to reconcile with that person. And he says, love one another even as I have loved you. How did he love us? By reconciling us back to the Father, so that we would be one with the Father. And now we are one body. We are to be one vertically between people and God, and we're to be one horizontally among different people. Now, reconciliation also empowers us to resist the attacks of the enemy. Negatively, the failure of believers to reconcile divides and isolates us, thus making us easy prey for Satan's attacks. But positively, if we are living peacefully and in harmony with each other, we possess the unity of a mighty army. We're able to succeed in the spiritual warfare in which we are engaged, so that the gates of hell will not be able to overpower the church. I mean, the famous maxim of all warfare is divide and conquer. If we're not reconciled, we're divided. But if we're reconciled, we are united. And our living harmoniously with and blessing others will result in God's blessing us. In 1 Peter 3, verses 8 and 9, Peter says, "To sum up, all of you be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, and humble in spirit, not returning evil for evil or insult for insult, but giving a blessing instead. For you were called for this very purpose, that you might inherit a blessing." We give the blessing of forgiveness and reconciliation, not returning evil for evil or insult for insult. And God says, if you do that, I'm going to bless you. So how can we not be reconcilers? So let us look now, practically speaking, how to reconcile. Now, we need to understand, just as forgiveness is a process and may take a long time for us truly within our hearts to forgive the person who wronged us and hurt us, reconciliation does not occur instantly, but it takes time and a number of stages. And so while there are a number of different models, and I talk about a couple of them in the book, I think probably the most practical model for how to reconcile and how this process is applied, again, is from Everett Worthington, and it is called the bridge model. It's a 4-step model, which he likens to a bridge, consisting of 4 steps or events: decision, discussion, detoxification, and devotion. So let's take a look at this. So the picture is the hurt, the wrong has affected the relationship. So picture 2 people on either side of a great divide or chasm. They're each standing their ground with this big pit or chasm in the middle of them. What reconciliation does is build a bridge across that chasm. But the bridge has to be built from each side, okay? Each person has to slowly by slowly work towards the middle to build the bridge toward reconciliation. And the first step is to decide. You have to decide whether or not I want to reconcile with this person. And again, each person has to decide, I want to reconcile and restore this relationship. Reconciliation cannot be forced, okay? That's why it takes 2 to reconcile. It only takes 1 to forgive, but it takes 2 to reconcile. So reconciliation requires movement on both sides, which means that either party can block reconciliation at any point along the way before the bridge is completed. The parties might start out, but for whatever reason, one party decides, I don't want to continue this. All right? That's not your fault, but you need to understand that's what's involved with reconciliation. So reconciliation involves time, effort, humility, and the risk of being hurt again or being taken advantage of again by the other person. Now, why wouldn't a person want to reconcile? Actually, there are a number of reasons why one of the people might not want to reconcile. First, perhaps he likes being apart and sees no reason to reopen the relationship. Second, it may be unhealthy or unsafe to reconcile if there is a risk of physical or other harm. Third, one person may have repeatedly violated trust, and he shows little or no true contrition or remorse. So unless you're willing to repent, and we said in an earlier lecture, repentance is not necessary for you to forgive the person, but their contrition and repentance is necessary in order to reconcile and restore the relationship. If they don't show that, then, I'm not going to take the steps to try and reconcile. That's a reason why people may not. Fourth, perhaps the hurt and the pain is so new and is too great, I just can't do it right now. Maybe later, but not now. And fifth, maybe the other person is dead or unavailable, or for some other reason it's not possible to reconcile. So there are some legitimate reasons not to reconcile. Of course, the ideal is that in all such relationships, reconciliation would occur, but there are some reasons maybe it won't. However, people do decide to reconcile. And they decide to reconcile because they don't like to accept a failed relationship. Maybe you value each other so much. You've been friends for a long time. You've been in business for a long time. You know each other well, etc., etc. And I value that relationship. It's been harmed now, but I'd like to see it back. Or, again, you've invested so much of yourself in each other and in the relationship that you're not willing to just see it go away. Fourth, you're not willing, you want to reconcile, but you're not willing to return to the status quo, but you want a better, stronger relationship. And that can happen when reconciliation occurs, as we will see. Fifth, people reconcile because they believe that pursuing reconciliation is likely to have more positive outcomes than doing nothing. Positive outcomes in the relationship, positive outcomes in my own life. So there are a number of reasons why people want to reconcile. But as part of the deciding, the decisional process, you need to decide how to reconcile. Now, reconciliation occurs in two ways. Most reconciliation is implicit. What does that mean? Parties reconcile without explicitly discussing reconciliation. I mean, they stop hostilities, they come together for a common task, they join together, and you've been friends. You might not talk about it explicitly, but that's how most of these things happen. But particularly in big cases, where there's a big hurt, and that's what we concentrated on in looking at forgiveness, reconciliation also occurs explicitly when the parties come together specifically to deal with the problem and restore the broken relationship. Now, we talked earlier in the last lecture about Matthew 18, about leaving your offering at the altar, going and seeing the person, and so on. Some people think that it is a law that requires we must always talk personally and privately with somebody who's offended us before we can ask others to get involved, to help us. But that's not true. In the Bible, in Genesis 32 and 33, Jacob, Abigail in 1 Samuel 25, Joab in 2 Samuel 14, and Barnabas in Acts 9 all intervened on behalf of others or employed others to intervene in order to bring about reconciliation before the parties who had broken the relationship got involved personally. And so, while personal conversation may be best, there are any number of cases whereby one can get a third party involved to help facilitate reconciliation. I mean, this is particularly true if you are in a culture, and this may be especially true in East Africa, or in a tradition in which it is customary to resolve problems through intermediaries, such as a family representative, a leader of the tribe, or some other trusted person. It's also certainly worthwhile to use a third party when you're going to somebody personally and privately, but if you do that, because of the culture, you feel it's likely you're going to lose face. So you use a third party to try and bring the two of you together. If you think you might feel intimidated by the other person because maybe he or she is smarter, more verbally fluent, is bigger, more intimidating, go through a third party. If you've been abused and you think there is some risk, but you want to try and pursue reconciliation, going through a third party might be a very wise step. And if the third person or third party has a closer relationship with the party you want to reconcile with, and if the party you want to reconcile with has been caught in some sin, the third party, the intervener, has a close relationship with him and might be able to bring up and talk about the sin better than you can. Again, you can use that to help facilitate reconciliation. So first, you need to decide whether or not to reconcile. If you decide that, you need to decide how to go about it. But you also need to decide when to reconcile. Reconciliation, remember, typically requires a period of time. Now, Christians, we should look for opportunities to initiate the reconciliation process. But before doing that, we need to look at our own emotional and mental state and our motives. Are we stressed? Are we angry? We should pray about this and deal with any mental or emotional or spiritual hindrances first. We need to assess the other person and his or her circumstances and pray for God's guidance. And we should always act in a Christ-like manner because that will help facilitate both explicit and implicit reconciliation. So we need to decide, do I want to reconcile? We need to decide how to go about it. And we need to decide, when should I do this? That leads, though, the decision, both parties decide, I want to reconcile. That leads to step 2, the second plank in the bridge, discuss. Once the decision has been made, the parties need to get together and discuss their relationship, discuss the divisions that have arisen, and how to restore the relationship on a good basis. Now, the best approach in doing this is to approach the other person with what's called a soft attitude. This helps you to talk softly, and that's vital to reconciling because a soft attitude is characterized by empathy and humility. Now, research indicates, and again, I'm quoting here from Worthington, who has researched this subject probably more than anybody else. It indicates that in many cases, regardless of what might objectively be true, both parties see themselves as the victim and the other party as the perpetrator. And both parties may come prepared to forgive the other person, but are completely unprepared to be forgiven themselves. In such cases, both parties are usually wrong. You see, but again, I mentioned this in connection with forgiveness, but it's particularly true with respect to reconciliation. If you look at objectively speaking, who is the party who is the least amount of wrong? Typically, the one who is less at fault, who wants to restore the relationship, if that person begins the process, it will help to facilitate the reconciliation. If I'm less at fault and I go to the other person and then, I confess my sin and I say, I'm sorry, and I have loved you for a long time, I love our relationship, and so on. If you're less at fault, that again will tend to help facilitate the other party then acknowledging, I was really more at fault, and so on. But in any event, if the less at fault person initiates, that's following Jesus' teaching in Matthew 7, which says, take the law out of your own eye before you deal with the speck in the others. And also, it will encourage the other person to confess his own sins. This is what one writer calls the golden result. It's the corollary to the golden rule. The golden rule says people will usually treat us as we treat them. But the golden result says, I'm sorry, the golden rule says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The golden result says that people will usually treat us the way we treat them. If we blame others for a problem, they will usually blame us in return. Contrary to 1 Peter 1, or 1 Peter 3, 8 and 9, where people typically will return evil for evil or insult for insult. That's why Peter says, don't do that. Return a blessing instead. But if we say, I was wrong, it's amazing how often the result will usually be, I was wrong too. Now, if your confession of wrongdoing prompts the other person to make sort of a half-hearted admission, pick up on that. And so if the other person says something like, well, I guess I sort of lost my temper too, or, well, it wasn't all your fault, you might respond like saying, well, I appreciate your admitting that you lost your temper, but may I explain how that made me feel? Or, I appreciate your saying that, but what do you think you did wrong? Or why do you think I was frustrated? In other words, draw it out. Just don't leave things on a superficial level. You're restoring a relationship. And in good relationships, there should not be secrets and superficiality. You gotta draw the poison, which is what we're going to be getting to in step 3 in just a minute. But when you're discussing, don't lash out at the other person. And remember, keep your expectations reasonable. It's going to take time and effort to reconcile. This normally cannot be accomplished in one get-together. Don't fall into the trap of denying what you did, or denying that you did anything wrong. Describe your feelings and so on, and don't say, well, you had it coming. No, that's not going to reconcile the relationship. Ultimately, both parties want to move to forgiveness and accept each other's forgiveness. You will want to focus on changing your own behavior, not the other person's behavior. You'll want to agree on a plan for restoring the relationship. So we've talked about deciding and discussing, but that leads, when I talked about don't lash out, get down to the heart of the matter. Don't leave things superficial. That leads to the third step, which is called detoxifying the relationship. When a relationship is broken because of some betrayal or hurt, it's like poison entering the body. Now, we need to rid ourselves and the relationship of that poison. So we need to deal with ourselves and eliminate the bitterness in our soul as we confess it. If God has forgiven us and has taken our sin and bitterness upon himself, we can no longer carry that bitterness and that burden. So, again, ultimately, these things are spiritual issues. Now, we need to remove the poison from the relationship. Research indicates, and again, I'm quoting from research that Worthington has done, that marriages and other close relationships tend to deteriorate in 4 predictable steps. First is criticism. First mental criticism and then verbal criticism. Secondly, defensiveness. First mental, then verbal. And this is characterized by snapping back at somebody who criticizes you, and it leads to arguments. The third step is contempt. Criticism and defensiveness tend to be based upon specific acts or qualities of the person, but contempt is directed to the other person himself or herself, and that leads to stonewalling or war. In other words, to avoid being hurt, the person withdraws and turns into himself or herself like a stone wall, or else there's open war designed to hurt the other people mentally, emotionally, or even physically. Now, research indicates that there is a direct relationship between the strength and happiness of the marriage or relationship and the ratio of positive to negative interactions. If a couple has 10 or 7 or even 5 positive interactions for every negative one, they're usually happy. At 5 to 1, however, an abrupt change occurs. Above the 5 to 1 level of positive to negative interactions, people generally see the relationship positively. But below that level, they tend to see the relationship negatively. And furthermore, when a relationship goes below the 5 to 1 level, it doesn't just go to 4 to 1 or 3 to 1. It dramatically drops off to 1 to 1 or even 1 to 2. In other words, only 1 positive for every 2 negative. So it's like you're at the precipice of a cliff, at the 5 to 1 positive to negative relationship between positive and negative interactions. After that, it tends to drop off dramatically. The idea of detoxification is to reverse that process. You have to consciously work on behaviors, words, thoughts that move in the direction from stonewalling or war back to contempt, from contempt to defensiveness, from defensiveness to criticism, and from criticism back to normalcy. So you can look for signs, whether we're poisoning or detoxifying the relationship. If we bring up past hurts rather than merely dealing with the current problem, you're putting in more poison. If we're overly harsh when we reproach the other person, that's poisoning the relationship. If we attack the person rather than sticking to the issue, and when we hear bitterness in our voice, or if we can't let go of past hurts, all of those things we need to be consciously aware of. But if we're working on detoxifying, that leads to the 4th step, which is devotion. We can finally reach the stage of restoration, true reconciliation, which involves devotion to the other person and to the relationship. We achieve this when we stop obsessing over the wrong and we resolve our grief by learning the lessons from the hurt. We see how we have changed and how it has made us and the relationship better. We reach a level of devotion when we build love, and we understand the other person more, and we love the other person more. When we do these things, not to devalue the other person, but to positively value him or her, we demonstrate our love to him or her. Thus, we decrease the negative and we increase the positive interactions. And we try to see those interactions from the other person's point of view. Now, increasing positive to negative interactions requires knowing the other person well and requires empathy. It requires knowing how the other person best senses and experiences being loved. There's what's known as the 5 love languages. These are universal. They apply in any kind of relationship. And they are this. This is how we demonstrate love. Number 1, words of love and affirmation. Number 2, physical touch and affection. Number 3, spending quality time with the person. In other words, focusing on each other. Number 4, acts of loving service, doing the things that otherwise the other person would normally have to do. And 5, loving gifts. In any marriage, in any close relationship, you should know how the other person responds, because people are different. I mean, in my own personal case, yeah, it's nice to get a gift, but that's not the main way that I feel loved. I feel loved primarily by spending quality time with my wife. And so they're different things. Now, some people getting gifts or hearing those words, and we all need to hear them, how we love and value the person. I know of a friend of mine in Uganda. In his culture, it's the women who cut the firewood and so on, but he does that for his wife. Why? It's countercultural, but he knows that she values that, and he values her. So know what are the 5 love languages, and how does the other person best feel loved. Words of love and affirmation, physical touch and affection, spending quality time with the person, acts of loving service, and giving loving gifts. When we do this, in the process of reconciliation, we come to understand the other person well, and we live the way that Christians with the mind and spirit of Christ should be living. This will become natural to us. It will happen all the time, and then people will see. This is how Christians are. This is how Christian relationships are supposed to be. This is what forgiveness and reconciliation is all about. It is transformative. It will affect you. It'll make for much more deep and wonderful relationships, and it will show others that we are true Christians. That, again, is why forgiveness and reconciliation go to the very heart of the gospel. I hope that as you apply these things, you will see great positive change in your life and in your relationships. And I not only hope that, I know it will be true. God bless you.